I have one foot in academia. I have another foot in practice. And actually, my first life is as a practitioner. I am the director of design for a firm called Moule & Polyzoides. And this name comes with a relatively weighty and a relatively controversial label that I have to carry, whether I like it or not, which is that we are one of the founders of a movement called New Urbanism. And New Urbanism is a very important term in America because depending on whom you meet in the street, they either want to hug you or they want to kill you. So it carries weight, and it's misunderstood, understood, stretched, overstretched. But I'm bringing this up not necessarily because it has anything to do with what I'm showing you, but because it is important to point out that as someone who's been exposed, I like to think exposed to a very clear advocacy to the inner workings of New Urbanism, I can say that while I have my own reservations about many things about New Urbanism and how I choose to understand it, one of the things I dearly admire about New Urbanism is that beyond the veneers of aesthetics, beyond the veneers of idioms, which is usually the domain in which the criticisms are received, New Urbanism has shown us that you can truly engage with more than the physical city. They are not the only ones that have shown us that, but they have shown us that in mainstream practice, it is also possible to engage beyond the physical city. And why I'm saying this is because what New Urbanists have done in the United States, and I want to emphasize in the United States, is that they have acknowledged the fact that there is a genre of city making which is made in the middle layer. It is not the alternatives of rural programs, not the alternatives for impoverished settlements. It is not the high-end Bilbao effect where you have massive budgets. It is the generic practice of the city, which deals with developers, which deals with bureaucracies, which deals with petrified transportation departments. And the process of practice is about immersing and navigating and engaging in the inner behind-the-scenes instruments that are making American cities. So the greatest contributions of New Urbanists have been that they have found or proposed, however imperfect they may be, alternatives to policies such as codes. They have actually created alternative manuals to transportation methods that have created sprawl. So it has been intriguing over the last 20 years watching this movement emerge. As I've myself thought from a distance what this means for other parts of the world. What are the new urbanisms with a small n and a small u, not a capital N and a capital U, in many other parts of the world that are part of this discussion that many of these wonderful people have talked about today. So not being a full-time academic and being sort of out there in the field has another preoccupation that I want to preface this with, which is I'm trained as an architect, and my entry into the world of urbanism comes from the point of view of an architect. I think urbanism is a term that's understood very differently by different people. One way of understanding it is that it is a bridge between planning and architecture. Planning is a relatively abstract, process-driven field that deals with policy making. Abstract in the sense that it doesn't deal with the tangible entities of physical environments. Architecture, on the other hand, deals only, largely, with the physical environments. Urbanism can be a bridge where you actually find a little bit of both. So what I want to show you today is a personal journey, sort of a biographical dive into how I've engaged with Asian cities, not from the point of view of intense academia, because I've not had the luxury of doing that, can't afford to do that with the kind of practice I have. But this is one of the reasons I engage with these incredible people, to challenge my own thoughts and keep things constantly questioning. One of the first modes of engagement for me has actually been in practice. And like I said, the definition for me is about constant negotiation. A negotiation between client aspirations on the one hand, extant power structures of a place that you design in, and then my own personal biases or what I believe places and physical environments should be. And I'm also saying this today because in high academia, we have the danger, I'm not saying we are doing it, but we have the danger of losing faith in the physical city, which is actually where I earn my bread and butter. I work with developers. I attract their attention every day because I have to believe that what I propose, what I engage in, is going to matter and will enhance people's lives. That said, I am painfully aware, I think it was Asiminam in one conversation that had said to me once, I think he even wrote about it, that there is one definition of urbanism which is a noun, which is common practice, the way I see it, the products of a city. But there is another definition of urbanism which is a verb, which is the processes of engaging with cities and behind the scenes. And what I'd like to sort of posit today as an argument is that it is a both and. They inform each other, they are intertwined and should not be separated as abstract compounds, abstract theories versus pure products that are done away from theoretical discourses. So this is a sort of a personal journey into my engagements. It's not so much to show you the project. This is a project, a new town in Saudi Arabia. The point is not to show you the project, but the point is to impress on you is that as we've attracted projects abroad, in the Middle East, in China, in other places, what has intrigued me is that on the one hand, it is actually possible to quite literally apply many of the ideas we use here, literally take it and import it to these places. And it is important to bring this up because it is a mode of engagement. As outsiders, clients demand this at some point. They know very well the kind of brands that they are asking you to bring in. In this case, this was a particularly interesting one because here the client allowed us to almost create a city that was a kind of a literal interpretation of the classic Islamic city. It is a town of about 100 acres, but there is every single element of an Islamic city. There is the campus in the middle, the mosque tilted towards the ocean, the sea, the souk right next to the north of the mosque, a block street grid which takes vehicles but creates a desert architecture that is really quite close. It's dramatically different from many of the other projects we conventionally see. But here's the point I wish to make. I find a lot of rubrics that tend to confuse the visual idiom of what they see with the intention of engagement and the relevance of engagement in other parts of the world. So I guess another way of saying it is drawings like this or like this are drawings that we do in mainstream architecture here in the United States. They apply quite literally as modes of engagement in other parts of the world as well. We should not be hesitant to be authoritative in trying to do this. Where we should be careful is in trying to understand how they would be implemented. And this is where the discussion really shifts. What are the modes of engagement that will make these projects happen? How do you complete them in the manner you have envisioned? What compromises do you make tactically along the way that make sure these projects actually win the game rather than lose? So in this case, for example, this is a project in Dubai. This was the Arabian Canal before the collapse of the economy. It was one of the largest projects being floated anywhere, a 75-kilometer long canal. And this is classic American urbanism taken and adapted, but in a way, is it? I mean, the idea of livability, the idea of walking, the idea of narrow streets, the idea of traditional cities is not new or old or American. This is an urbanism that exists everywhere. So the idea of looking at the traditional city of a particular place, the physical construct of a traditional city, is a mode of engagement. And it is important to bring this out because these are other ways of engaging with Asian cities that might or might not reach the deeper aspects of academia. The other project I want to show you as a practice project is a very recent competition entry. We were finalists, one of 4 finalists in an international competition for a fascinating project, a new campus, a new Jamia for the Bora sect of the Bohras are an Islamic sect in the world, parallels with these. The Ismailis are on one side, the Bohras are on the other. They're headquartered in Mumbai. The site was in Nairobi, Kenya. Now, the reason this was a fascinating mode of engagement is because while on the one hand it was a campus and it was an international competition, there were certain differences related to the faith and the way their lives are led, which I'll talk about in a minute. But on the other hand, this was an open call to us as competitors to put out there our biases on what an ideal Islamic campus should be. So on the one hand, the mode of engagement was a catch-22. You have to understand the workings of a campus on its own terms, in terms of how these people are going to use it. But on the other hand, bring in a very authoritative bias, if I can call it so, about what a campus is and how one should design it. And the point is not to get into the details, but simply to tell you that the mode of engagement here was fascinating. We had no idea about what the Bohra community really was all about. As we delved into their history, we understood that their roots were in the Fatimid period in Egypt. That's where they originated. There was a diaspora that went all over the world. They are now headquartered in Mumbai. They have a very hierarchical structure, a spiritual leader who's called the Dai, who is the equivalent of a spiritual head, a pope of sorts. And there's a hierarchy that follows, and the people have a sort of an amazing adherence to the spiritual head who protects them and takes care of them in every way. It was extremely moving and revealing to see what many people would call an anachronism, which taught us amazing lessons about what truly community, and particularly socio-sacred communities, are all about. There were other interesting differences. Gender separation was extremely important. The campus, we started the campus by a biased idea that the campus has to be a sort of a very fluid place where people can interact. But we learned during the early phases that gender separation was one of the prime ideas, and it was not necessarily something to look at as a negative thing, although we may see that from an American standpoint, but something that is an intrinsic part of the Bohra culture. So the entire campus had to be separated into two sections, with the mosque in the middle and the genders completely positioned in their own separate ways, which transformed the idea of how we think of campus making here or in many parts of the world. The images you see are ways of showing places, but again, the point I wish to make is not necessarily the imagery, but again, the mode of engagement. Many of the clues of Fatimid architecture were completely unknown to us. The language, the vocabulary, they are extremely sensitive and they're extremely proud of an inherent heritage that they're keeping alive. So it was very important to be politically correct in what you draw. We engaged with a diaspora of the Bohra community actually in Woodland Hills right here. So I would go and sit with them almost once a week, and they have a jamia right there, a small school where they are taught Quranic scriptures and in their own language and so on and so forth. And it was incredible to sit with them one-on-one to try and understand the workings, the inner workings, the daily workings and seasonal workings, which actually led us to the inner workings of the campus. So to sort of say this another way, if there is an image that we see at first glance, whether it's a night shot, a day shot, that may seem familiar, the nuance of engagement in many other parts of the world is not necessarily in the kind of pictorial imagery that you see in the end, but the behind-the-scenes processes that go into making them. So again, to say it another way, it is the verb of the process of engagement that becomes far more important as a mode than the product that eventually emerges. The product might be a veneer or might be a profound difference in terms of something you've seen, but that eventually takes a second place to the process that you engage in. The second mode of engagement for me personally has been scholarship. Observing and excavating, and I want to emphasize the word excavating, a lot of subtexts that personally for me are about debunking my own stereotypes, not necessarily someone else's. And one study that has been particularly dear to me is a study that I continue to be fascinated by, which is the issue of the religion, and in my case, my own religion, which is Hinduism. I was born in India in a Hindu family, and I was exposed to the workings of Hinduism ever since I was a child. And my own perceptions of Hinduism changed as I grew, and I pursued a career in a particular way. And I took these 3 slides because I wanted to sort of talk to you about my own evolutions in Hinduism, not necessarily as a faith, but as a cultural construct, as a cultural engine, and perhaps as a catalyst for transformation, or perhaps even as an intellectual trigger. The slide you see at the bottom left is the common image of Hinduism. This is a religion with thousands of gods. And as a child, this is what fascinated me as much as it confused me. How can you have 1,000 gods that eventually are one God? This is very confusing to a child. I have a tough time explaining it to my own children now. As I grew up and I began to become an architect, this is a temple in Goa, the most famous temple of Goa. And it began to fascinate me as my radars began to get trained that this temple actually doesn't resemble any other Hindu temple in India. Because all other Hindu temples, a common image of a Hindu temple was about a spire that was pyramidal with a flag on top. But when you look at a Goan temple, it looks almost like the pinnacle of the temple where the deity is located actually looks like a Renaissance cylinder with a dome on top and a Renaissance lantern. So clearly, the tropical idiom of a sloped roof merged with the hybridities of colonial architecture here. And the temple eventually became the hybrid result, a sort of mongrel offspring that was found neither in Portugal nor in India, but distinctly became Goan, a point that Robert was making in terms of Java. And then as I grew up and I became an urbanist, I pursued a career in planning and urbanism, what began to fascinate me was not so much the built forms of Hinduism, but the phenomena that were catalytic to the formation of larger habitats in Hinduism. In this case, anonymous wayside shrines. So it's pretty clear when you go to any city in India, from the largest metropolis to a rural town, a rural village, that there's one consistent phenomenon that's going on. And that is that in the remote corners, whether out in the fields or under a street tree, there are these anonymous encroachments. They are illegal. From an American standpoint, they're completely illegal encroachments into the public realm. But they're there, and they represent hopes and places for millions of underserved who want a stake in the city. So what does this mean? So I began to investigate this over the years, and the best way of looking at it was to reflect, observe, and document, and therefore engage in this idea of what this meant. So the series of sketches, you have a tree. The tree gets an anonymous stone or a lingam or a yoni placed under it. The tree begins to grow, and a rudimentary structure arrives. The structure becomes more franchised, and then there comes a point when the structure becomes so conspicuous that it begins to attract other entities that are directly related to it. So it becomes more symbiotic, and it begins to spark the beginnings of a habitus. And finally, it becomes so conspicuous that it becomes legal. And you have drawings, you have priests, you have canonization that comes in, and eventually it becomes a temple. Another way of saying it is, some of the biggest temples in India, the temple in Madurai, the temple in Srirangam, temple of Mahakal in Ujjain, were once anonymous shrines. So if you dig into the histories of these temples, and this is what began to fascinate me, they were not built at once complexes, although they may look that way today. They were actually incremental processes of piecemeal ad hoc activism and growth that was completely devoted to faith. And these places were so powerful, the energies, these forces were so powerful that they had the energy, they had the ability to create entire towns. So the question I was asking myself is, does this have relevance today? Because this phenomenon continues today. And if it does, shouldn't we be talking about it in the mainstream dialogues of planning and urbanism? So this is a documentation of a shrine in Connaught Place, which is the central business district in New Delhi. And right in the middle, out of nowhere, one morning, I was walking at around 4 or 5 a.m., and I chanced by a little shrine. So I stood there for 2 hours with a camera, documenting the entire activity. And from about 5 a.m. in the morning to about 8 a.m. in the morning, when the first devotee comes, you have a series of sequences, which is part of a bigger documentation that tells you these amazing rituals in a microcosm that are happening in the city, even as the rest of the metropolis is continuing in its own way. So this is an important point of solace for many people that needs to be recognized, and there are hundreds of these across the metropolitan landscape of India. My research led me to villages. As the search continued, this is my own village in Goa. My ancestors come from this village. And you began to realize that the temple doesn't work alone in isolation, obviously. It works in a completely synergistic, ritualistic relationship with the habitus. On seasonal events, this is a palanquin within which the deity is placed. And it's bedecked with 100,000 of red flags, and that's the chariot which is danced every year on that auspicious day. These are pretty typical of many temples, also their physical guises may be different. And this is a sequence of what is done. The entire community in the village participates in this. To the drum beat, the chariot is lifted off the ground. It is then danced to the plaza below the temple. It is then taken up the flight of steps onto the temple, danced within the temple precinct, then around the temple precinct, all the way through the morning. You can see the darkness of the sky going away. And finally, it is taken and distributed to the devotees. So we began to document and map these various habitats. And again, my bias as an architect came in. I was more interested in the morphology as much as the phenomenology and the rituals, trying to understand the relationships, physical as much as phenomenological, between the temples and the habitats themselves. But there was more as we went on to the rest of India. A fascinating phenomenon where there was a consistent series of identifiable patterns that were now emerging in these habitats. So when you went to South India, particularly Tamil Nadu, which is a Dravidian region, a tropical region in South India, it's a state now. There was, over the years, now there's emerged a consistent identifiable pattern of the relationship, morphological relationship with the temple and the town. And what it is not unlike what Robert was showing us in Java, in Cambodia. You have the temple in the middle, and you have a series of lobes that are created incrementally around it, one after the other, which actually forms the town. So imagine there's a shrine. The shrine keeps growing, but it doesn't grow in an ad hoc location. It actually grows in a fortified manner in every stage. And this is the antithesis of the medieval European town, because the medieval European town has a wall outside. The temple of South India has the wall immediately around it, while the rest of the habitat is actually left loose. So as the town grows, sometimes you have walls that are drawn around it, sometimes not. But eventually, the temple becomes a fortified precinct around which the habitat really rotates. So what we ended up doing is began to ask ourselves, well, is there an evolutionary pattern that we could trace? This is a diagram showing a plausible evolution. There's no record of this, of the Meenakshi temple in Madurai. We dug into scriptures, we dug into a lot of material, but there's no clear record of how it evolved. But one possible track could be that you had a shrine originally. This is recorded in the Skanda Purana. There is a record of a coward finding a lingam in a forest and informing the king about it. And two shrines are known to have been constructed, one for Shiva and one for his consort Parvati, as two separate compounds. The compounds gel, becomes a complex. The complex simultaneously finds itself in the middle of a growing town. Every major town in Tamil Nadu that we documented had this exact pattern, although the nuances of the morphology might have been very different. So we began to go on a sort of a campaign to try and document something that had not gone completely unnoticed, which is the relationship, the morphological relationships between another kind of habitus, which was the sacred Hindu habitus. That there were in fact towns, distinct towns around temples, where the population was devoted largely and singularly, I would argue, to one use, and that is to serving a god. So there was actually living a life devoted to the service of God. And this is the page from the book which is goes all the way from the villages down to the large towns and eventually ends in the city of Benares, which is to the left. And all this led me to the city, which I remain obsessed by, which is Benares in Varanasi, which I'll be talking about a little later, a city that remains the oldest living city in the world. Again, largely has a very complex history now because it's gone through many invasions and many rebuilds. But the ethos of the city is still dominated by a largely Hindu idea, and among others, but what this means has many other connotations. In this case, just to show you one, the map below shows what is called a national pilgrimage circuit, 4 major shrines devoted all along the country, one in north, south, east, and west, devoted to the god Vishnu. They're called the Char Dhams. A devout Vaishnavite, a devout worshipper of Vishnu, actually takes this pilgrimage and goes once in his lifetime to all 4 spots. And if he's done it, he's been blessed by this great god. That symbolic geography is actually emulated in Varanasi. Now, you and I do not see this. You and I do not have the eyes or the knowledge to comprehend these inner workings of the city. But there is another set of people, there is another set of experiences that read the city and engage in the city another way, through pilgrimages, through circuits, through shrines, forgetting the physical construct of the city, and actually engage in a cognitive engagement of the city, which is very different than the ones you and I are usually used to. So all this culminated into a book that was released last year. It's available. It's a little expensive, $75, and it was not in color, which was very sad. But it's there. So and hopefully will lead to others. The third engagement for me was the idea of propositions. Now this is an interesting one because as someone who's not a full-time academic, who doesn't have the luxury of being paid to do scholarship, you sit back and you do wishful thinking. Well, what if? And sometimes you reach a point where it compels you to think of a what if. So in my case, this was a town in Iran. This happened as pretty much a serendipity. I was doing research on towns and cities of Persia, which have always fascinated me, particularly as an Indian. I think it's very important for us to dig our roots. I don't think you can understand Indian culture without understanding its Persian roots, for that matter, many other roots. So as I was digging into morphologies of Persian cities, I came across a town called Yazd, which is known all over the world as the town of wind towers. We commonly see this, it's a World Heritage Site, and it has hundreds of wind towers, and that's what it's famous for. But as I read more about it, it was an anomaly, and the anomaly was that while other major towns like Shiraz, Isfahan, many other Iranian cities were always located along water bodies, for obvious reasons, in the desert, Yazd was one of the few towns, perhaps the only one in its extent, that was completely away from any obvious water body. So as an urbanist, the first question you asked is, well, what's the logic here? How does a town like this sustain itself? And it was this that led me to get into sort of investigating the science of the Qanat. The Qanat is a subterranean piece of infrastructure that exists below the town of Yazd and stretches for 10 kilometers. So why did this city come into existence? Well, it was a halting spot along the Silk Route. And as the trade route developed, this town began to become the hub. It was Alexander the Great's prison. He put his prisoners. It then became the hub of the Zoroastrian faith. And it grew over the years into a hub. But how did it sustain itself? Well, the Zagros Mountains, which are 10 kilometers away, have snow every year. And the snow actually infiltrates into the aquifer. And over thousands of years, what these people have developed is a science not unique to them, but is found in many other parts of the world, not necessarily in every part of the world, which is an underground system of channels called Qanats or Karres. So what they do is they go to the aquifer and they dig wells at 50-foot intervals, 50-meter intervals, and then connect them underground by a channel that goes all the way through. This gigantic piece of regional infrastructure begins in the aquifer, comes down first to the fields, then into reservoirs called abanbars, which you see right there, then into the mosques, and finally under every house. So what this meant for me, as a sort of someone interested in morphology, is that the wind tower that had gotten so much attention worldwide was eventually the end piece of a gigantic piece of regional infrastructure, which would have no meaning if we had not understood how the city works. So from a preservation rubric, while you may preserve the houses and the wind towers, there's a much deeper thing to talk about here, which is a city that has sustained itself and received its sustenance from an incredible piece of hydro infrastructure. It was very important to try and engage in what this meant. So the Qanat actually works this way. It comes into the fields. These are the abanbars, and finally the houses. Now, the Qanat construction remains alive to this day, but obviously Yazd has sprawled, it has become a huge city, and what's happened to the Qanat is because it relies on gravity flow, it simply cannot provide the city with the amount of water that is needed. So Qanats are being neglected and they're being vandalized. There were about 70 Qanats 10 years ago. Today there are barely 30 that are alive out of 3,000 that were there in around 1972. So it's been a dramatic change. These are shots from the museum in Yazd. You can see this sort of perilous engineering of being underground, away from oxygen, and sort of digging these channels. So this entire dendritic network under the town is a marvel of civil engineering, which has remained completely unnoticed because we have engaged in looking at what's above the surface without asking a question of how to engage with the deeper issues that keep this town alive. Abanbars, these are the reservoirs. Again, incredible pieces of architecture. The dome structure, the section is particularly fascinating. No one is given physical access to the water. The Qanat actually brings the water and fills the abanbar. You have towers that keep it ventilated, but the staircase, which is called a pashir, the people come down, and at various levels of the pashir are faucets, and depending on the height of the faucet, you get water temperature. There is a whole administrative system in the villages of Yazd even today that's in place. You have people who administer rights. So basically you have the Qanat, you have the aquifer, the water comes into these abanbars that are located throughout the city, and from the abanbars are other networks that give you water to your houses. So if you want water into the well of your house, in the courtyard, you go to this particular person in your community, you pay him money, he opens that particular faucet, and the water comes into your house. So there is a parallel microsystem that works even today, although it is failing. Well, the other fascinating thing was the abanbar had social dimensions to it. So the location of the abanbars was not ad hoc. What we noticed is that there was a hierarchy in the architecture and the placement of the abanbars. Abanbars that were neighborhood specific typically had about 4 towers. Those that were intra-neighborhood typically had 6 or 8 towers. So there was a relationship to the form of this piece of infrastructure and where it was located and how. And this is a section through the house which tells you how the Qanat, which you can see the line below, brings the water into the courtyard and actually facilitates ventilation in the very hot summers. Now, as we documented the history of the city, there was a dramatic revelation. From 1979 to 2008, the city has sprawled to almost 30 times. So rapid urbanization is not unheard of in those parts of the world. And Qanats have completely declined. So if you look a little bit closely, there are black spots on the white until about 1979. Those black spots are the main abanbars of the city. So all the way from the pre-Islamic era to 1979, people were building abanbars. The Qanat system was alive, even though it was waning. By 2008, if you look at any of the areas, there's a much simplified diagram of a bigger documentation. There was not one single abanbar that was constructed after 1979, which means that the system was completely going away. And as we documented this further, we began to understand something else, that in relation to the abanbar, the logic of the abanbar regionally in previous times was that it was related to the amount of agriculture footprint. So the more agriculture you had next to the footprint of the town, the more abanbars you needed because you wanted to cater to the area around the city. And what these graphs reveal is from 1925, when there was a lot of agriculture, which you see in gray, and this little city developing with a lot of white, which is the Qanats bringing the water to the fields, to 2011, you can see that the historic core of the city is in black. The city has sprawled. The Qanats have almost disappeared, and there is a growing street network that is now sprawling outside the city. Very obvious, very predictable, but you see it viscerally when you look at it. So what we eventually did was propose a series of scenarios, what I call propositions. This was theoretical at best, because we realized that even if we wanted to, this was far away from reality, because neither do we have enough access to Iran at this point, nor has Iran, despite civil engineers being fascinated by the system and writing white papers about it, has not engaged in a sophisticated system that maps this subterranean dendritic network. So there is no official documentation. We have no idea where the qanats are. For all you know, they've been buried with other buildings and all kinds of things. They are toxic for all you know. Nobody has tested them. The system exists. What can you do about it? So here's the proposition. The proposition was that it would be naive to have UNESCO and other, while UNESCO efforts and ongoing efforts to preserve the qanats through training efforts and so on is a good thing. Nobody was questioning that. Our proposition was a little more provocative because we had nothing to lose. Our proposition was, while you're trying to save the qanat, the reality is the qanat has really no use in Yazd. I mean, it really doesn't, because except for nostalgic emotional appeal, why would you save the qanat except in the remote hinterlands and agriculture and rural villages? Why would you bring the qanats into the city when it cannot give you even the basic amount of water that you need? So what we proposed is, perhaps on a hypothetical level, you could use them as grey water systems. So imagine you have a dendritic network under you, right there. It's all existing. Can you create, by intervention, by monitoring, by putting anti-gravity or enhancers, create a system where all the buildings, the major mosques which use water every day, the buildings, the commercial buildings, can all of them have a parallel system where the water that's now used, grey water, not black water, but grey water, you can bring the water down, put it into the qanat system, take the water against gravity back into the Aban bars, convert the Aban bars into treatment plants, and bring the water back into the communities, thereby saving water for the desert and reducing the impact on the city grid. Wishful thinking, but we explored other scenarios. Well, there were a number of problems with this. Over 3,300 qanats within the Yazd province, around 3,000 are increasingly polluted with industrial charge. So these are realities that confronted us. Even if this is wishful thinking, it's extremely difficult to implement this strategy. How do you take the toxicity from the qanat away? How do you document it? And then the final one was, could you actually engage qanats and Aban bars as part of intensive development? So as Yazd grows, which it absolutely will, can development actually become more strategic in using these qanats? Can policies be brought in where you incentivize developers to bring in qanats into their developments, perhaps as a tool, perhaps as grey water system, perhaps as something else, but instead of leaving them there, make some use of them. The hypothetical finding, the conclusion of this study basically was that Iran at some point is going to go through a massive national drought. It's going to happen. I mean, this has been predicted. This is known. Now, what's happening in Iran is most of the water is actually coming from rivers. They're dams. I mean, engineers, I mean, most of the rivers have been dammed. In fact, Yazd itself gets its water from more than 10 miles away, the Zayandeh River, which brings water through a massive dam. The problem is most of these rivers are seasonal. So if there is a drought, the obvious thing is many of these rivers are going to dry. River water is going to be unpredictable. The only source of water you're going to be left with is the water in the aquifer. And this is a very nuanced subject, but as we talk to scholars from Yazd, what they explain to us is the theory that they're beginning to realize, particularly in the engineering circles, hydroengineering circles, is that the kind of secret to success of Iran they are proposing is that there should be a relationship between the amount of water in a habitat versus the footprint of the habitat itself. And if Yazd goes through a massive drought, qanats may be the only source that keep it alive. So I just want to end with two things. My interest in Banaras brought me to a studio here in Price, which we did last semester. And I don't want to talk too much about it, except for one point. The structure of the lab was made in a way that tried to challenge the way I usually work, which is we go to a site, we analyze it as practitioners incompletely, dangerously, and then we propose interventions, largely physical, perhaps even strategic, that are done with the best of intentions, the best of judgment, but perhaps with less interest in legacies. And the idea was to bring to students' notice that sometimes reversing this process may actually have a lot of advantages. So what we ended up doing is, rather than going to Banaras in the first weeks of the semester, which is what should have been done in a conventional urban design studio, because how can you design something without going to a site? we ended up using documentation, Skype, and many other methods to learn from Banaras in the university and other scholars what the phenomenology and the issues of Banaras were about, because they had already documented them. The second part of the lab was simply to unleash these students. And one of the great advantages, which was fantastic from a point of engagement, is that many of the students at Price, some of whom I'm going to present, are all from multiple disciplines. So we had architecture, anthropology, NGO management, economics, public health, all these amazing disciplines that were coming in. So rather than trying to sort of insinuate urban design or urbanism, to use their expertise in trying to engage with the city and see what it brings out. So we unleash them to encourage them to hunt from their own countries, in this case Fez, Morocco, in this case Canada, all kinds of concepts, completely unbiased for a minute about what this means to Varanasi. The third part of the lab is when we actually went to Varanasi. And I'll let them explain this, but I just want to point out that the journey to Varanasi was not one of observation. It was actually one of verification. And this is what I wanted to bring out, that as practitioners, it would be so fantastic if we could perhaps ask for a shift in the process, where instead of observing and reflecting only, perhaps propose and then verify with the people themselves. So when the students went there, the filter to the efficacy of their proposals was not them and not a jury, but actually the people. We met with an entire transect of Banarasis, all the way from hermits to the municipal commissioner himself. And we tested the verification of these proposals. The intent was not to finish the studio by saying, I got it right or wrong, but to actually teach the students that somewhere in the middle of the process is a red line, which says that above the red line, I was in the United States. Below the red line, I'm actually in Banaras. What does that mean for me? What has it verified for me? And what does it mean as a mode of engagement? So these are many of the student projects, which two of us we will see. So I'm not going to get into that. But and the last thing I want to conclude with is a mode of engagement that really is about collaborative forums, where you actually acknowledge the fact that as a single mind, no matter how bright you may be, you are limited, and that you can never substitute the power of collective collaboration. So the book actually, for me, was one such experiment, where we brought all these incredible minds together, minds who were superb in their own way. They were doing their own independent work. But bringing them together creates a movement, creates a power that I think can launch other means of thought. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll take it on from there. Thank you.
Okay, let's go ahead. First question.
So, sorry about that. Quick question. So, fundamentalism, does fundamentalism also mean that if the old way of traditions and living styles vanish, the old architecture styles and other urbanism may also vanish? So we'll end up have different kinds of urbanism that's detached from history.
So, question for both of us?
No, I think for you.
That's not for me. Okay, you can say that again, please. So what is the question?
So my question is about historical preservation and the continuation of the traditional lifestyle and also architectural forms. So if the infrastructure and the action, the substance of the former living style vanished, will the urban form and urbanism also disappear?
Well, I don't think there's a linear answer to that in a way, but I'll address in the context of Yazd. What we discovered is we took the position that we should not be afraid of understanding tradition and heritage as an evolving entity rather than a static entity. So rather than saying that, yes, UNESCO has to come in and sort of preserve these qanats, well, what does it mean to preserve a qanat? Are you preserving it as a physical artifact? Are you preserving it as a system? Are you preserving it as a phenomenon? So there are all kinds of complex questions in theory. But we took a much more pragmatic approach, which is to say, well, what do qanats really represent for Yazd today? And the fact is they really don't represent much, because the city has many other expectations. And we are not saying this as in abstraction. There were many experiments done by the UNESCO to keep qanats alive, particularly in Aleppo and other places. What they discovered is you can go to a village, you can even go to a city and repair a qanat. But 2 years later, when the team comes back, the Kanath has again been neglected, because the legacy, it's not the repair, but the legacy of your repair is eventually in the hands of other power and other people that are far beyond your control. So what we call for is either a shift in perception and reading, or perhaps another kind of savvy in terms of how you create the perceived world rubric of preservation in the first place.
One more question? Yes.
Asim, I think your presentation and then probably the presentations from before as well remind us of, or remind me of architect as anthropologist. And if I think anthropologist and architecture, I think Lisa Peedy. And one of her primary critiques was that architects tend to see the world through the images and the drawings that they create. And Vinayak and I have had many conversations about this particular thing, but one of the things his presentation reminded me is architects do still draw, and they still visually represent what their sort of interventions want to be. I wonder, is there a way to visually communicate the social construction of knowledge? It's something that I've been struggling with myself, and I'm really interested in how architects can break the role of expert, and I think one of the ways that they fundamentally maintain that expertise is their ability to draw to a particular audience. And I think Asim, you sort of said, I have my perfect plan, but you take it out into a world of non-architects, and it's not intelligible outside of that. So is there a reflective visual practice that might come forward as we think sort of more substantively about the social realities linked to kind of architectural and urban practice?
Can I just ask you if what you mean by that? Do you mean properly? Is there a way to use drawing to socially construct knowledge? Is that a fair way?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I
Okay.
think, how do architects and urban planners reflexively communicate visually?
Okay.
Yeah, there's a big trend now where there's a lot of mapping going on.
Yeah.
Mapping of knowledge, mapping of fields, mapping of neighborhoods. There are apps being developed for mapping, open source mapping, which is all great, and which I think is a step in the right direction, but what's missing from that is criticality.
Exactly.
So you map, but so what? Like, what are the patterns? What are the underlying assumptions?
That's, I think, what
How do you do critical mapping? And there are people working on that, but it's not caught on in a big way. But absolutely, I mean, I think one of the great things architects do, there are a lot of things architects can contribute, and it's the visual expression, but also they know how to think visually. So it's not just, we might see the representation, but visualization as a mode of thinking, generate ideas, brainstorming, collaborating, and so forth. And the other great thing I think that architects have to contribute is they are, at least the good architects, are inherently interdisciplinary. Like when you're doing an project, like the campus or anything, you have to understand education, you have to understand climate, all those things. So I think there's a lot to contribute there, and I think it can be quite promising. I'm not sure how it will happen, but I think it's happening now. I see a lot of people talking about, like my colleagues, students. I was just talking to some students who are creating a new app for mapping informal settlements. And the question that people there can map it, right? Their public spaces, events. And the question I always ask students is, so what? Okay, now you map all the public events. So, like, where's the criticality there? Like, what more are you bringing to it than, because there are thousands of people now doing this stuff. That's my interest, is like, what does it actually do apart from just conveying information?
And can I catapult that to Vinayak when you brought up about some of the things that new urbanism has done to engage communities, and I think specifically the Charette. To what extent is the Charette an example potentially of drawing as an instrument of the social construction of knowledge?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, the charrette, I'm not sure. I wouldn't credit the charrette as a new urbanist idea. I mean, just for the record.
Certainly.
I think it was far. Yeah.
Certainly.
So they shouldn't get credit for things they don't deserve.
But I think, a problem.
Yeah. But I think
this one they might deserve.
I think the thing they do deserve is and I'll say this from experience. In many of our charrettes, what we like to do is, unlike abstract planning, we actually like to illustrate quite viscerally, quite immersively, literally, every building footprint. I encourage my students to do this all the time. So we get away from rectangles of land use where a community is like, what the hell are you talking about? I don't understand where my house is. To actually drawing every single house. As architects, we have the ability to do it. We call them illustrative plans. But so that's sort of the golden feather that new urbanists sort of carry and say, we are much more transparent in the way we engage with communities. So you engage in the 7-day workshop, and at the end of it, the whole room is smeared with perspectives and drawings. The catch is, and I speak from live experience, if you have a community that's pro-growth, that drawing flies. That drawing is loved because someone comes and says, that's my house, I love what you're doing, you're making a better street for me. If the community is no growth, that drawing is a disaster. Because the community actually misunderstands it as you're going to build the whole thing at once. No matter how much you explain to them that this is a hypothetical rendition to try and tell you what's going on. So you have to, what I'm trying to say is, you have to be extremely careful about the relationship between social messages and modes of representation. I don't think you can just take a one-shoe-fits-all, which I think is known, but it becomes very clear when you're dealing with communities because they're a very great filter to understand the message that you're conveying through a drawing.
And just to be clear, I think you're talking about the mode of charrette in which the experts are still producing those perspective drawings that are on the wall.
Correct.
The community there's an earlier mode of charrette in which communities have blocks and clay and trees and markers, and they are actually doing the drawing, which is not what you're talking about.
True.
Yeah. I think that's, I mean, even like, it's sort of what Meredith was saying. I mean, that can also evolve. One of the problems of the way the new urbanists do charrettes, it's always the person, like, we have experts drawing, and the two challenges with that is, like, I was in a charrette like that where we did it, and later somebody came to me quietly and said, and where's our input in this? Sort of, they couldn't see it was there, but they couldn't see it because it was, again, these beautiful drawings. But the other thing is, is to, maybe that can evolve where it's more participatory, more of a partnership. I mean, there's never an ideal partnership, which is also kind of a false thing that, everybody's all equal. There's sort of, I guess the point I'm making, is a way to make it more messy, more give and take, and I think that has to be found.
Just in how you visualize the mess, that be what is still acceptable.
Like with a camera.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is there's obviously never one way. I'm always skeptical if somebody says this is it, but the other answer to that is experimentation, is to constantly try things out. In fact, I mean, what you're saying about the mess, something which triggered in your presentation, obviously you really love talking about Yazd, and we love listening to you. And what I got from that was when you were talking about the temples and temple cities and Yazd, is this wonderful complexity and richness of those places, which is beyond just a simple diagram. I mean, like your diagrams, which are always over time, which is fantastic, which is really captures urbanism over time. That's sort of the hidden dimension people forget. And I think it does capture the wonderful richness and complexity. And I was wondering, as primarily a practitioner, how does that understanding of this wonderful richness and complexity over time inform your practice? Which most people, who have architecture degrees, it's about the object.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
And how do you, because you have that sensibility, and how do you sort of bring that in from time to time in the work that you do?
Well, maybe this is the last thing, and then we'll move on to the students. I remember, this was about 2 months ago, I think. I was at a charrette in Albuquerque, and out of frustration, I went to the corner and actually wrote an email to Asim. And I vented how frustrated I was with the easiness of urban design in the United States, because it is so simple in a way when I look at it from an Asian standpoint, Asian, just to use it as an example, that you have the luxury of going to a client or a developer or even a city, in our case, in our practice, drawing a vision that you believe is transformative. In many ways it is. They like it, you like it, everyone likes it, you do it together. And chances are it will happen physically. Physically, it will happen. I mean, if you draw a park, it will happen. You draw a street, it will happen. But you have absolutely no idea how it will behave, how it will be received. You have absolutely no idea. And we live, in our constraints, I have to admit, in a state of denial, because we, as people who have to find the next project and the next one, we don't necessarily look or care about time. So I accept that critique 100%, which is why perhaps looking at alternatives compared to the United States are so amazing when you look at South America or Asia, because as a person who grew up in Asia, the physical city is completely taken over. I mean, and this is a beautiful phenomenon. It's not something to feel ashamed about. It is the richness of the city. I have not seen a single building in India or even in Japan, where we were recently, that has not been taken over, that has not been interpreted by the people that use it. Whereas in the United States, you are so chained in a way that there are agencies that interpret what the public realm is for you, even though they may pretend that you participated in its doing. So I find American urbanism in that sense extremely manipulative, although I do it myself. Perhaps this is my way of questioning that.
There is a camera in it. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.